In just 7 minutes, a black congresswoman was fined $500 million without trial, without evidence, and without a single chance to speak. The courtroom didn't feel like a court that day. It felt like a cage. The judge, a sitting Supreme Court justice. The verdict, pre-written. And as cameras rolled and millions watched in silence, the message to every voice like hers was deafening. Stay silent or be crushed. But what if they picked the wrong woman? Her name is Jasmine Crockett, and what she said next didn't just shake the room, it cracked the foundation beneath it. What you're about to witness is a dramatized retelling, based on real fears, real power structures, and real emotions felt by millions of Americans who've watched justice bend too easily beneath the weight of privilege. While the events in this story are fictional, the pain they echo is not. The injustice may be imagined, but the outrage it mirrors is very real. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. And the question it leaves behind isn't about her, it's about us. When justice folds that quickly, who will stand the next time the gavel falls? The courtroom wasn't ready, not for her, and certainly not for what was about to happen. It was just after 8 a.m. in Washington, D.C., but the air inside the Alexandria Federal Courthouse already felt thick, as if the building itself knew something wasn't right. The floors were too clean, the light too white, and the crowd too silent, like they were attending a funeral no one dared to name. Jasmine Crockett entered through the main doors alone. No entourage, no camera crew. Just her pressed navy blue suit, a single worn briefcase, and that signature calm she had worn through 1,000 battles. But even calm has its limits. She looked out across the room, not for support, but to register who was there. Reporters pressed shoulder to shoulder like vultures sensing blood. Their eyes weren't curious. They were hungry. In the gallery, congressional staffers sat upright, earbuds tucked beneath perfect hair, pretending to check email. But their screens weren't glowing. They were listening. Jasmine's attorney, Illa Hartman, leaned in, whispered something, but Jasmine didn't respond. She kept her eyes forward, locked on the bench. And that's when the tension snapped. Because seated there, in full judicial robe, without announcement or explanation, was Justice Clarence Thomas, a Supreme Court justice, presiding over a civil hearing. It didn't make sense. It didn't belong. No one said it out loud, but the question trembled in the silence. Why is he here? This wasn't a high-profile criminal case. This wasn't federal espionage or a matter of national security. On paper, it was a civil dispute, a donor discrepancy allegation tied to the federal Hope Forward initiative, a program Jasmine had championed to redistribute educational funds to low-income communities. A policy success story until someone claimed it hid misappropriation. No details, no audit, just a single line in a leaked memo and a rush-filed motion that moved faster than any court schedule should allow. Jasmine had received the subpoena less than 24 hours ago. She hadn't even seen the full complaint. Yet here she was, seated beneath the seal of the United States, accused in front of a live-streamed audience of millions. The camera lights flickered to life. Microphones extended like bayonets. The clerk cleared his throat. And then it happened. Clarence Thomas didn't ask for opening remarks. He didn't request a summary of the case. He didn't even glance at the defense table. Instead, in a voice as smooth as granite and twice as cold, he read a ruling that hadn't been deliberated, hadn't been debated, hadn't even been spoken aloud before this moment. The court, he said, finds Representative Jasmine Crockett liable under civil fraud statutes in connection with the misuse of federal donor classification under the Hope Forward initiative. Damages are assessed at $500 million. The air stopped moving. Reporters gasped audibly. One stenographer dropped her pen. Jasmine didn't blink, because she knew this wasn't justice. It was performance. There had been no discovery, no witnesses, no chance to respond. Just a number, $500 million, dropped like a guillotine. The courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and she wasn't a defendant. She was the execution. Everything about the moment felt wrong. The speed, the silence, the absolute absence of due process. Even seasoned journalists, Those who had covered death penalty cases, war crimes, and foreign tribunals stared, stunned, unsure whether to take notes or call their editors. And yet Jasmine remained still, not out of shock, but because something deep inside her had been expecting this. Not this exact moment, but this kind of betrayal. She had warned people it would come. When a black woman speaks too clearly, rises too far, and refuses to be bought or broken, they don't debate her, they erase her. But here's what no one saw, at least not yet. Jasmine had come prepared, not with a counter-argument, not with anger, but with strategy. Because what the system didn't know, what even Justice Thomas hadn't anticipated, was that Jasmine had already seen this play before. And this time, she wasn't going to be the one caught in the trap. She was going to be the one who lit the match beneath it, and the only question now was how far the fire would spread. 4 blocks from the courthouse, in a private conference room on the top floor of a neoclassical building with bulletproof windows and soundproof walls, 3 men in tailored suits sat beneath a chandelier no one ever looked up at. The room was quiet, too quiet for what they were planning. In the middle of the table lay a single manila folder, stamped "Confidential" in red. On the front, taped neatly, was a black and white photo of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, paper clipped to a 2-paragraph summary that said everything and nothing all at once. It didn't need to say more. These men already knew what she had done. Not wrong, but right. And that was exactly the problem. Malcolm Reed, federal prosecutor turned political showman, tapped his pen against the table in slow, deliberate rhythm. His expression was unreadable, but his intent wasn't. He leaned forward and muttered, "She's too clean." His voice held no admiration, only calculation. But no one stays clean under pressure. He didn't believe in innocence. He believed in narratives. And Jasmine's narrative, reformer, outsider, voice of the voiceless, was beginning to work. Too well. Across from him sat 2 Department of Justice advisors, both lifers in the system, both connected, directly or indirectly, to the very corporate pasties Jasmine had scorched during her recent floor speech. In that speech, streamed millions of times online, Jasmine hadn't just called out corrupt influence. She'd named names. She'd quoted numbers. And most dangerously of all, she had done it with calm precision, no shouting, no dramatics, just facts spoken like indictments. It had rattled donors, embarrassed power brokers, and started whispers in corridors that had long gone unchallenged. They weren't afraid of her style. They were afraid of her momentum. Focus groups showed she was gaining traction with not only progressives, but also with independents, veterans, even disillusioned conservatives. She spoke about broken courts, about whistleblowers imprisoned for doing the right thing, about children drinking lead-tainted water while corporations filed billion-dollar tax deductions. And people listened. Because for once, the messenger didn't sound like a politician. She sounded like someone who had lived it. So the plan they needed wasn't complicated. It was brutal, but simple. Open a civil fraud investigation using vague accusations of donor mismanagement tied to Hope Forward. Skip the indictment, skip discovery, skip any window for defense. Instead, strike hard with a pre-written judgment that would turn her into political roadkill before midterms. Let the media fill in the blanks. Public outrage would split along predictable lines. The truth wouldn't matter. The optics would. But optics needed authority. They needed a name big enough to make critics pause. That's when someone floated it. Clarence Thomas. He wouldn't prosecute. He wouldn't write the charges. He'd just be the face of the ruling, the robe, the gavel, the illusion of legitimacy. Reed had made the call himself. One conversation, one expensive dinner, one untraceable favor, a promise disguised as patriotism. And so on a cold March morning, as the cameras blinked and the crowd buzzed, Clarence Thomas stepped into a courtroom he didn't belong in and wrapped the Constitution in silence. Because the goal wasn't to convict Jasmine Crockett, it was to crush her spirit so thoroughly she wouldn't dare rise again. But they underestimated one thing. She had spent her whole life surviving systems just like theirs. And this time, she came with receipts. The silence following the verdict wasn't like silence in a courtroom. It was the kind that comes after an explosion. Too complete, too sharp, as if even air molecules were afraid to move. Clarence Thomas's voice still hung in the air like smoke. $500 million. No deliberation, no justification. Just the sound of institutional power doing what it had always done. Declare, punish, erase. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her spine didn't shift. Her hands didn't tremble. And her gaze never dropped from the marble bench in front of her. But inside, a storm was beginning to turn. She knew this wasn't just an ambush. It was an orchestration. Every element had been arranged. The rushed hearing, the sealed courtroom, the presence of Thomas instead of a civil judge, the media already positioned. This wasn't about legal consequences. It was about optics, a political crucifixion under the guise of jurisprudence. They wanted to make an example of her, to pin her voice like a moth beneath a pane of glass, forever preserved as a warning. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't built her life on stagecraft. She'd built it on survival. And survival teaches you how to smell a setup before the walls even start closing in. Slowly, without shifting her posture, Jasmine leaned ever so slightly toward her lead counsel, Illa Hartman. The gallery saw nothing. The cameras caught only a tilt. But Illa heard it, soft, calm, nearly imperceptible, but enough to split the story in two. Jasmine said 9 words. "It's time. Flip the cards, every last one." To anyone else, it would have sounded like poetry. To Illa Hartman, it was detonation. For weeks, they had prepared for a legal battle. But in recent days, something had changed. Strange messages had come in through secure lines. A whistleblower, anonymous, determined, and terrified, had slipped an unmarked envelope under Illa's hotel door 3 nights earlier. Inside was something they hadn't dared open until now. Classified DOJ documents, internal audit notes, encrypted emails flagged as privileged communication. Enough to raise serious alarms, but too dangerous to reveal unless the system showed its hand first. And now, it had. Illa's fingers slid beneath the defense table. No movement wasted. She retrieved the envelope, thick, golden, slightly weathered, but sealed. She had waited for Jasmine's signal. Not panic, not outrage. Precision. The kind of calm you only find in someone who's been through fire and learned how to breathe inside it. As Illa stood, the courtroom noticed. It was the way she moved, measured, slow, grounded like storm clouds rolling over dry land. Her heels struck the floor with intention. Not arrogance, not appeal. Warning. Malcolm Reed's eyes narrowed. Clarence Thomas shifted almost imperceptibly, as if sensing a shift in gravitational pull. Illa said nothing as she placed the envelope on the bench, the seal still intact. But everyone in that room, even those who had come only to observe, felt the same chill creep down their spines, because something had changed. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a trap, and Jasmine Crockett had just turned it inside out. The summer heat in Dallas didn't just scorch, it clung. It rose from the pavement in shimmering waves and filled lungs like smoke. That morning, Jasmine Crockett was already running behind. Her old sedan had sputtered out 2 blocks from her apartment, the gas light blinking like a countdown she couldn't argue with. She popped the door open, grabbed her file folder, and slammed it shut, knowing full well she wouldn't have time to call for help, much less wait for a tow. She looked down at her heels, cursed under her breath, and kicked them off in one motion. The sidewalk was brutal underfoot, but she didn't flinch. She was due in court in 12 minutes, representing a client who had no one else. Her name was Gloria Mays, a 73-year-old black grandmother facing eviction from a building owned by a cousin of a state senator. The paperwork had been a mess, deliberately, Jasmine suspected, and the eviction notice came down fast and aggressive, the kind of move that bet on the tenant not having time or resources to fight. But Gloria had called a neighborhood legal aid hotline in tears, and Jasmine had answered. She didn't ask about money. She asked about the details. That's who Jasmine was even then, someone who cared more about the facts than the odds. She ran, past honking cars, past a man yelling something lewd from a truck, past the bank where her own balance was dangerously close to zero. Her hair stuck to her neck, sweat running down her spine, but her grip on the folder never loosened. She clutched it like a shield. thin, creased, held together with a paperclip and hope. The courthouse loomed in the distance, old and stone-faced, like it was daring her to try. She sprinted the last block, breath catching, legs burning. She arrived with 30 seconds to spare, barefoot, flushed, and entirely unbothered by appearances. Inside, the bailiff raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The plaintiff's attorney smirked. He had a silk tie and a smugness that assumed he had already won. Jasmine ignored him. She found her spot, set down her folder, and stood tall. When the case was called, she didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for the lease agreement, the maintenance records, the violations report. And when she began cross-examining, her voice was steady, her questions surgical. She didn't grandstand. She sliced. Even the judge leaned forward. By the time she reached her closing argument, the courtroom had shifted. The plaintiff's lawyer no longer smirked. He shuffled papers that didn't help him. The judge asked her to repeat her final point, and when she did, quoting housing codes from memory, there was a beat of silence, and then a gavel. Gloria Mays stayed in her home. That night, Jasmine walked home with her heels in one hand and a receipt for victory in the other. Not a paycheck, not applause, just the knowledge that for once, the law had bent towards someone who'd always been beneath its notice. She didn't know it yet, but that morning in Dallas would echo for years, because that was the first time Jasmine Crockett learned she didn't need power to win. She just needed to arrive anyway. Jasmine Crockett didn't grow up with silver spoons or prep school uniforms. She grew up with silence, the kind of silence that stretches between overdue bills and eviction notices, where the hum of the refrigerator feels louder than the conversation at dinner, because no one wants to admit the milk might not last until Friday. Her earliest memories weren't birthday parties or bedtime stories. They were of her mother hunched over a kitchen table with a pen in one hand and a shut-off notice in the other, trying to decide whether to pay the light bill or buy groceries. Jasmine would sit on the floor nearby, legs crossed, pretending to read while stealing glances at the strain in her mother's face. That's how she learned what desperation looked like, not from textbooks, but from the woman who taught her how to endure it. Their apartment complex was always in some state of decay. The stairwell lights flickered, or didn't work at all. The hallway carpet smelled of mold, and the locks were a suggestion, not a guarantee. Jasmine remembered how grocery stores in their neighborhood kept baby formula behind glass, how she had to wait for someone to unlock it like she was asking for a favor instead of food. She remembered how the playground equipment was rusted, how her friend's little brother had broken his wrist falling from a slide that should have been condemned. No one sued, no one even complained, because in her world nothing broke, it just stayed broken, and people adapted. She was 7 when she watched a police officer pin her cousin to the ground over a misunderstanding with a bus fare. Jasmine had screamed, but her aunt pulled her back, whispering, "Quiet, baby, don't give 'em another reason." That sentence stuck with her, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. She learned early that in certain zip codes, silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. But Jasmine wasn't built for silence. Not for long. At 12, she started spending afternoons at the local library, not because she loved reading, but because it was the only place with air conditioning and answers. She devoured everything: history, law, biographies of women who had kicked down doors in rooms that weren't made for them. She wrote essays on napkins, arguments on the backs of church bulletins. She didn't tell her friends. She didn't talk much in school, but she was building something quietly: a fire, a clarity, a vocabulary for resistance. Her first job was working the counter at a dry cleaner after school. She made minimum wage and saved nearly every dollar, not for clothes or music, but for bus fare to the courthouse downtown, where she'd sit in the back row, listening to trials she didn't yet understand, trying to memorize how lawyers moved, how judges reacted. She wasn't studying law. She was studying power, and she could see it even then: who it protected, who it punished, and who it pretended not to see. Years later, long after she passed the bar and wore the suit and carried the briefcase, Jasmine still kept her first paycheck framed: $234. It was for a pro bono case, defending a teenage boy who had been accused of vandalism because he'd drawn a mural on the side of a condemned building. The city called it defacement. Jasmine called it a voice finally being seen. He had never spoken a full sentence in court before, but after she won, he shook her hand and said, "No one ever asked me anything that wasn't a threat." That stuck too, because Jasmine had come from a world where questions were usually warnings. And the day she realized she could change that, for even one person, was the day she stopped wondering if she was enough. She was more than enough. She was the storm they never saw coming. Before there were podiums, before CS-PAN cameras or primetime hearings, Jasmine Crockett spoke from folding chairs in church basements and pickup truck beds parked outside union halls. Her speeches weren't rehearsed. They were remembered. Remembered from childhood nights when the air conditioner didn't work, from the smell of bleach on her mother's apron, from the stares she got every time she walked into a courtroom where no one expected a barefoot girl from South Dallas to outthink a man in a $1,000 suit. She didn't talk like a politician, and that's exactly why people listen. Because she didn't campaign to be admired. She spoke to be understood. She told people the truth, not the polished version, but the kind that hurt to say out loud. This system wasn't made for us, but that doesn't mean we stop demanding more from it. Her first rally didn't even have a microphone, just a group of laid-off sanitation workers outside City Hall, cardboard signs flapping in the wind, and Jasmine standing on a milk crate with a legal pad in one hand and a borrowed bullhorn in the other. The sign someone handed her simply said, "Don't talk down, talk with." That became her philosophy. She didn't preach, she translated. Housing law, voting rights, labor protections. She broke them down into stories. A mother evicted because her Section 8 paperwork got lost. A veteran denied benefits because the system misspelled his name. A teacher fired for speaking up about asbestos in the school gym. She told the crowd, if they can do it to one of us, they can do it to all of us. And if they're afraid of our voices, that means we're already louder than they thought. There were no polished campaign ads, no corporate donors, no party machine grooming her for leadership. What she had were flyers photocopied at corner stores, volunteers passing out granola bars and voter registration cards, and crowds that grew larger every weekend. The people who showed up weren't likely voters. They were tired. Tired of being told to wait, tired of being told to behave, tired of being invisible until election year. They didn't wear matching shirts or carry banners with slogans. But when Jasmine spoke, they leaned in, even if they didn't always agree, because they could feel she meant it. And when she finally ran for office, after years of resisting the idea, after every excuse to stay on the sidelines had dried up, she did it the only way she knew how. Loud, grounded, and unbought. Her first campaign event was held in a parking lot behind a shuttered grocery store, the same one where formula had once been locked in glass. 124 people showed up. They came with lawn chairs, kids on their hips, questions scribbled on the backs of receipts. She stood in front of them and said, "This isn't about me. It's about you never being ignored again." When she won by 612 votes, the local papers called it a political upset. But those who knew her story knew better. It wasn't an upset. It was inevitable. Because when you give people a voice loud enough to echo past the gatekeepers, they don't whisper, they rise. And Jasmine Crockett had never needed permission to speak. She had only ever needed a reason, and now she had millions. Malcolm Reed wasn't the kind of man who walked into a courtroom to find justice. He walked in to win. And winning to him had nothing to do with truth. It had everything to do with control, of headlines, of narratives, of perception. His name had appeared on Sunday morning talk shows more times than on actual case briefs in the last year. He dressed like someone who understood television, not law. Perfect suits, razor fade haircut, a voice trained to sound like certainty. Reed had long since realized that in an era of 24-hour media cycles, the verdict mattered less than the image of the verdict. And Jasmine Crockett, she was an image he couldn't afford to let grow. She was getting too much attention for the wrong reasons, or rather the right ones, and that was the problem. She wasn't incendiary in the way political operatives like to frame opposition. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't corruptible. She was precise, steady, and unnervingly clean. She'd exposed two multi-million-dollar lobbying schemes in a single term, dismantled a congressional subcommittee's shady procurement deals with 3 sentences, and refused to join any of the invisible handshake clubs on Capitol Hill. More dangerous than that, she was catching fire in districts that didn't traditionally swing her way. Her speeches were spreading, her message was crossing boundaries, and her refusal to be bought made her impossible to control. Reed didn't need her to lose. He needed her neutralized, silenced. Not with scandal, that wouldn't stick. No, she needed to be buried beneath something heavy enough to stain her name forever, something the public wouldn't understand fully, but would fear instinctively. Fraud, financial impropriety, misuse of federal funds. The kind of accusation that sounds like smoke even without fire. He didn't have hard evidence, but he had something better: access. The Hope Forward initiative had been one of Jasmine's proudest legislative victories, a federal funding program designed to redirect philanthropic donations directly to student debt relief, bypassing traditional bureaucratic gridlock. It was complex, digital, and brand new. That meant there were glitches, and glitches meant vulnerabilities. Reed's team flagged a donor classification irregularity caused by a third-party software vendor, a back-end sorting tool used by over 24 federal programs. It was a non-story, a system hiccup. Jasmine had no administrative access, but with the right phrasing and the right media leak, it could be rebranded as mismanagement, or worse, fraud. He drafted a civil complaint not meant for trial, but for impact. There would be no jury, no witnesses, just a rushed emergency motion filed under an obscure procedural loophole and fast-tracked to a ruling. To give it weight, he needed a figurehead, someone with the gravitas to make even skeptics pause. That's when Clarence Thomas's name entered the conversation, not as a co-conspirator, but as a symbol. Reed didn't need Thomas to believe it. He just needed him to preside over it. A few quiet calls were made. A dinner was arranged. No words were said on the record. Only the kind of nods exchanged by men who understood power as currency. Days later, the paperwork was sealed, the courtroom assigned, and the clock started ticking. Reed didn't smile as he signed the final motion. He didn't need to. The game was already moving, and Jasmine Crockett had just stepped onto a board built to swallow people like her whole. But what Reed never considered, what his ambition blinded him from seeing, was that Jasmine didn't play by the rules of men like him. She rewrote them. There was a strange electricity in the room, the kind that made the hair on your arms rise even when nothing had happened. Yet, just as Clarence Thomas sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable, the golden envelope now rested before him on the polished bench like an unopened casket, its seal still intact, but its presence already altering the oxygen in the room. The clerk didn't dare ask what it contained. Malcolm Reed sat frozen, his thumb tapping against the side of his leg, betraying the only sign of nerves he'd shown since the hearing began. The cameras kept rolling. The public was watching, and Jasmine Crockett didn't move. The seal broke with a single pull of a fingernail. Slow, deliberate, final. Thomas drew the first document from the envelope and unfolded it with the caution of someone handling something radioactive. His eyes scanned the top line, then stopped. His brow tightened, not with confusion, but with recognition. It was a Department of Justice internal audit report, stamped confidential. Do not distribute. The header was dated 3 months before Reed had filed the civil suit. The subject, preliminary findings, Hope Forward initiative, donor classification discrepancies. Line after line confirmed what Jasmine had always suspected. The financial anomaly in question had nothing to do with her. It originated from a back-end data processing tool, an algorithmic sorting system licensed to the Department of Education, used to auto-classify donor tiers based on input tags. The issue, a software glitch, acknowledged by the vendor and documented internally. The audit clearly stated that the error was systemic, affected multiple programs, and, most crucially, that Jasmine Crockett had neither administrative access nor operational oversight. She had been a legislative sponsor, nothing more. That alone was enough to cast the ruling into question. But then Thomas turned the page, and the courtroom felt as if it tilted slightly, like a building shifting on its foundation. The second document was an email thread. Redacted names, government headers, timestamps. The subject line chilled the room. Crockett Optics. He read the first line silently, lips parted in disbelief. If we don't move on her now, she'll dominate midterms. Use donor confusion. The public won't question a fine. The media will fill in the blanks. The second message came from a different address, marked with a Justice Department domain. Thomas will give the ruling teeth. A Supreme Court name kills backlash. Timing matters. Get it done before October. A beat passed, then another. Someone in the press gallery dropped their pen. A reporter froze mid-type, hands hovering above the keyboard like they had lost function. Even the court stenographer blinked, unsure whether to keep writing or look up. Because this wasn't just a misstep or a procedural violation. This was a plot. Clarence Thomas didn't speak. He didn't look at Jasmine, not yet. His hands trembled, just slightly, as he set the pages down. He'd read thousands of documents in his lifetime, signed rulings that shaped history, but never had paper felt this heavy, this damning. His throat tightened. The seal might have just broken minutes ago, but in that moment, something else had shattered too. The illusion of neutrality. And the courtroom, once a theater built to destroy Jasmine Crockett, now sat in stunned silence, awaiting its reckoning. For a moment, no one dared move. The courtroom had turned into a pressure chamber, every breath shallow, every blink delayed. Even the air felt different, heavier, charged, as if something sacred had been broken and the room didn't yet know how to grieve. Malcolm Reed was the first to shift, but only slightly. His fingers hovered above his briefcase, unsure whether to grab the folder that held his notes or shove it away, like it had suddenly become radioactive. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words emerged. Jasmine sat still, not in triumph, not in relief, but in calculated stillness, like a chess player who knows the checkmate has already been placed, even if her opponent hasn't yet seen it. Clarence Thomas remained motionless on the bench. The documents lay before him like ash after detonation. His hands, once steeled by decades of judicial distance, now trembled as he gripped the edge of the desk. Not to stand, but simply to anchor himself. He had read it all. The audit, the emails, the timelines. And with each paragraph, the truth grew impossible to ignore. This was not negligence. This was orchestration, a systemic, premeditated effort not just to discredit a public official, but to weaponize the judicial system as a political sledgehammer. It wasn't just that the allegations were false. It was that the entire case had been fabricated to appear inevitable, designed with surgical precision to manipulate perception. The use of his own name, his presence in that courtroom, had been part of the plot. He had been used, not asked to rule, not trusted to decide, just needed as a name, a mask for legitimacy. And now in front of cameras, reporters, and history itself, Clarence Thomas could feel the marble throne beneath him cracking. Across the room, Reed's assistant leaned in, whispered something sharp and urgent, a suggestion, a strategy, a plea to pivot. But Reed didn't react. His eyes stayed locked on the table. His shoulders slumped, not from defeat, but from the realization that the machinery he had built had just been exposed, not behind closed doors, not in private leaks, but in the middle of a live broadcast courtroom. There was no PR spin strong enough to repair this in real time. The clerk shifted nervously. A security officer near the back of the room touched the radio clipped to his belt. In the press gallery, someone whispered, "This is going to be bigger than Watergate." But no one answered, because everyone, from the reporters to the jurists to the spectators, knew they weren't watching politics anymore. They were watching something rupture. Still, Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to, because for the first time in this entire ordeal, the weight of proof didn't fall on her. It fell on them, on the prosecutors, on the justice system, on the robed man who now sat face to face with his own image in a mirror no longer warped by power. And as Clarence Thomas finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot, jaw tight, he didn't see a defendant in front of him. He saw a witness, a mirror, and a reckoning that had only just begun. Justice Clarence Thomas's voice, when it finally came, did not boom across the courtroom. It arrived quiet, edged with something unfamiliar, restraint, and perhaps just beneath that, something else, shame. He leaned forward, both hands planted on the bench like a man holding himself up, not out of decorum, but necessity. "Mr. Reed," he said, his tone measured, deliberate, and devastatingly calm. "Do you have anything to say before I proceed?" The question floated through the room like smoke, slow, curling, inescapable. It wasn't a courtesy, it was a last chance, a final narrowing door that would never open again once closed. But Reed didn't answer. He blinked. Once. Twice. His jaw flexed, then froze. His fingers, which had gripped pens, podiums, and press conference microphones with such swagger, now trembled minutely against the polished wood of the prosecution table. He looked not at Thomas, not at the audience, not at Jasmine, but down, at the files in front of him, at the words he had written, printed, rehearsed. They meant nothing now. They were ashes pretending to be structure, and even he knew it. He opened his mouth. Nothing came, not even a whisper. His throat constricted, the weight of his own machinery finally pressing back. Across the courtroom, flashbulbs clicked. Journalists scribbled in stunned silence, documenting not just a legal turning point, but something rarer, a man unraveling in real time, not just professionally, not just politically, but existentially, because Malcolm Reed hadn't just been caught lying. He'd been caught believing in the lie so deeply, so completely, that he'd forgotten what truth even sounded like. Jasmine didn't gloat. Her eyes didn't narrow. Her mouth didn't twist into any version of satisfaction. She simply watched him the way a surgeon watches a heartbeat monitor after the final incision, not hoping for death, but for revelation. Because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about exposure. And Reed, whether he wanted to or not, was now exposed, not as a villain in full control, but as a tool used by a system that fed on ambition and discarded those who failed to close the deal. His assistant whispered again, more frantically now. Reed waved her off, fingers jittering in the air, like a drowning man pushing away a lifeline. He straightened his tie too tightly. His breath came too fast. The lights that had once loved him now felt like interrogation lamps. Hot, accusing. His polished shoes scuffed against the tile as he shifted in his seat, legs uncertain whether to stand or flee. And still, he said nothing. Thomas watched him carefully, the silence between them no longer respectful, but clinical. This was no longer a court proceeding. This was an autopsy of power. Reed had been the sharp end of the gavel, the hand behind the headline, the architect of destruction. Now he was the subject, the cautionary tale. The noise of the courtroom faded beneath the weight of that truth. When Reed finally moved again, it was not to speak, but to slump further back in his chair. Deflated, swallowed by the very silence he had once weaponized. And Jasmine? She remained still. Not because she was hardened, but because she knew what it meant to be hunted. She had worn that silence once too, but she had survived it, and now she had reclaimed it, not as a muzzle, but as a verdict. Reed's silence said everything the country needed to hear, because when the truth stands tall, the powerful don't roar. They go quiet. The silence didn't end when Reed collapsed into it. If anything, it deepened, thickened, like the last seconds before a coming storm. Jasmine Crockett remained motionless, her hands folded neatly on the defense table, her eyes locked forward. She didn't reach for the documents. She didn't turn toward the gallery. She didn't nod, didn't blink, didn't breathe louder than necessary. It was a stillness not born from passivity, but from intention. It was a stillness honed over years of being underestimated, of being talked over, dismissed, judged by tone before content. Jasmine understood that in a world built to distort voices like hers, sometimes the most powerful sound was the absence of noise. And now at the center of a courtroom designed to crush her, it was her silence that began to rearrange the very shape of the moment. The cameras, still rolling, tried to find drama in her restraint. The network scrambled for commentary, but anchors faltered. because Jasmine didn't fit the script. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't crying. She wasn't performing for redemption. She was bearing witness. And the nation, watching from living rooms, hospital break rooms, airport lounges, knew it. They felt it. Something in the way she held her posture, the way her eyes didn't flinch under the weight of accusation now turned inward, spoke louder than any statement she could have delivered. In the minutes that followed, hashtags erupted online like wildfire. Crockett was right. Neutralize her. DOJ conspiracy. But one rose above the rest, simple, chilling, undeniable. Number, she didn't flinch. On cable news, commentators struggled to maintain composure. Some tried to pivot, to cast doubt on what was unfolding live before their viewers' eyes. Others, more honest or perhaps more afraid, said what the moment demanded. This wasn't just a courtroom twist. This was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't just endured the ambush. She had outlasted it without raising her voice. Meanwhile, in the chamber, Justice Clarence Thomas leaned back slightly, finally breaking his gaze. He looked not at Jasmine, but at the gallery, the press, the ceiling, as if searching for something that had slipped away. When he spoke, the tone had changed. The gavel didn't slam. There was no gesture of authority, only the voice of a man realizing the bench beneath him no longer offered sanctuary. This court, he said, his voice catching just slightly, finds the judgment of $500 million levied against Representative Jasmine Crockett to be unjustified, procedurally compromised, and legally unsound. The words didn't drop. They rippled. One journalist gasped audibly. Another dropped their phone. Even Illa Hartman, who had remained composed through every twist, turned her head slightly toward Jasmine with the first hint of visible emotion. Not relief, but awe. Jasmine, however, did not react. She remained still, not because she was numb, but because she had known this was coming. Not the exact moment, not the exact reversal, but the day when truth would finally swing the hammer instead of the other way around. And outside the courthouse, the nation began to shift. Protesters erupted into cheers. Flags were raised not in celebration of a person, but in recognition of a principle that had refused to be silenced. Jasmine hadn't rallied the crowd. She had become the rally. Her stillness had held the line until the nation found its voice. And now that it had, it was thundering. It started, as these things often do, not with a press conference or a headline, but with a file name. Plain, undistinguished, sitting quietly on a government whistleblower forum's upload queue, overlooked among thousands of other PDFs, audio clips, and blurred screenshots. It was titled DOJ NMT Call Internal 721, Final.mp4. No thumbnail, no description, just a runtime, 4 minutes and 32 seconds, and an anonymity that made it nearly invisible. But at 3:47 a.m., a low-level researcher for a nonprofit watchdog organization clicked play. She was expecting another dry budget call or compliance memo. What she got made her sit upright, then stand. The footage was raw, a virtual DOJ meeting, screen recorded from a private channel. 6 boxes on screen, each a face hardened by bureaucratic fatigue, none realizing, or perhaps not caring, that the conversation was being saved forever. The audio was clear, the tone casual, too casual. And then came the sentence. Carl Hensley, Deputy Director of Public Affairs, leaned back in his chair and said without flinching, "We need to move now. If we don't neutralize Crockett before the midterms, she's going to be unstoppable. She's media fluent, reform-minded, and worst of all, clean." There was a pause, then a chuckle off screen. A woman's voice followed, amused but uncertain. "Clarify. Take her out. How?" Hensley didn't hesitate. "Leak something, invent something, doesn't matter. You saw what we did with Hope Forward. Run the numbers, find the holes, bury the truth in paperwork. People don't check. They want clean headlines. Give them a villain, not a verdict." 5 seconds of silence followed. Then someone cursed. The screen went black. By 7:38 a.m., the clip had been posted anonymously to a small subreddit dedicated to government transparency. By 8:05, it had been reposted over 40,000 times. And by 9 a.m., It had hit the front pages of every major news outlet in the country. The nation didn't need analysis. It didn't need interpretation. The footage spoke for itself. This wasn't conspiracy theory. This wasn't speculation. This was proof, unfiltered, undeniable, unspinnable, that the machinery of justice had been hijacked with surgical precision to destroy one woman who refused to play by the rules of silence. The backlash was immediate. Protests erupted across 12 major cities. In D.C., demonstrators surrounded the Department of Justice with signs that read, "She spoke." They schemed. In Dallas, someone painted an 8-foot mural of Jasmine's face on the side of a courthouse wall with the words, "Truth survives." On TikTok, college students posted split-screen reactions. On Facebook, veterans who once doubted her now said she was the first politician they'd believed in years. Inside Congress, the effect was no less seismic. The Oversight Committee called an emergency bipartisan session within hours. Subpoenas flew. Careers stuttered. Resignations loomed. Carl Hensley was placed on immediate unpaid leave. As he exited the DOJ building, cameras clicked like machine guns. Reporters shouted, but he said nothing. He didn't have to. The world had already heard everything it needed to. The truth was no longer whispered in back rooms or hidden in sealed folders. It had been broadcast, and the system finally had to answer to it. There was no grand stage, no balloons, no patriotic montage playing in the background. Just a podium, one microphone, one light flickering overhead in the East Conference Room of the old federal building, once a forgotten relic, now the epicenter of a national reckoning. Reporters packed the room elbow to elbow, not for spectacle, but for something rarer. Truth unfiltered by handlers or strategy. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the frame without music, without a smile, without a script. She wore no makeup. No stylist had touched her collar. There was nothing manufactured about the woman who had just survived being politically buried alive. And that was exactly the point. She didn't wave. She didn't clear her throat. She simply looked out at the crowd, at the country, and began. "If you're expecting fury," she said, her voice calm and steady, "you won't find it here today. If you're expecting revenge, look elsewhere. I didn't survive what happened to me to shout at a podium. I'm here to deliver the one thing that almost cost me everything. The truth." The silence was immediate, not passive, but leaning in. Even the most cynical journalists in the back row stopped typing, not because she was loud, but because she was still, grounded, intentional. "My name was dragged through the mud," she continued. "My reputation was nearly destroyed. I stood trial without evidence. I was sentenced without argument. And the system, your system, my system, was ready to bury me under $500 million because I refused to play by the rules they never wrote down, but always enforced." A ripple of movement passed through the room. Not resistance, recognition. "I'm still standing," she said, "but I refuse to be the exception. I didn't walk out of that courtroom just to clear my name. I walked out to make sure the next person never has to stand where I stood, with nothing but a spine and the hope that someone, somewhere, would still care about facts." She pulled out a single sheet of paper. No stack, no teleprompter. Just a handwritten outline in dark blue ink. Her voice didn't rise, but her clarity did. "So today I'm introducing 3 reform proposals, not because they're easy, not because they're politically convenient, but because they are necessary, and because if Congress won't act, the people will know who stayed silent." She raised one finger. "First, a law mandating full and immediate disclosure of exculpatory evidence in any federal case. No more delays, no more loopholes. If the government has information that proves your innocence, it must be handed over immediately. No negotiation, because withholding the truth isn't a strategy, it's a crime." Then a second, real protections for whistleblowers, not symbolic language buried in subclauses, real enforceable legal immunity, independent reporting channels, emergency legal defense funds, because no one should have to choose between their conscience and their career. And then the third, a bipartisan, permanent judicial oversight council, with teeth, with transparency, empowered to investigate prosecutors, judges, and federal agencies. No more hiding behind robes. No more immunity by design. She paused, letting those three pillars hang in the air like scaffolding. This isn't just about fixing what happened to me. It's about rebuilding what they tried to destroy. Justice, when weaponized, becomes a tool for power, but justice, when accountable, becomes a shield for everyone. Still no applause, still no theatrics. Just a final sentence, barely louder than a whisper, yet sharp enough to pierce through the concrete walls. Yesterday, I was on trial. Today, the system is. By Monday morning, the draft was already written. No consultants, no committees, no softened language engineered to pacify both sides. Just one woman, one night, and one legal mind sharpened by every bruise the system had tried to leave on her name. The title was unassuming, the Transparent Justice Act, but its content read like a scalpel. Not a political document, but a diagnosis. And for the first time in years, Congress had no place to hide. The bill hit the floor quietly, slid onto the desks of every member of the House Judiciary Committee without press release or ceremony. No co-sponsors, no procedural stalling, just a single-page document attached to an envelope marked urgent, response to systemic failure. Jasmine didn't hold a press conference that morning. She didn't take interviews. She simply submitted the bill and went back to her office, where she closed the door, turned off her phone, and waited. Not for applause, but for resistance. It didn't come. What came instead were knock after knock at her door, from members who had once ignored her, mocked her, dismissed her as too emotional, too aggressive, too young to understand how this place works. They weren't congratulating her. They were asking if they could sign their names next to hers. Because the wording of the Transparent Justice Act didn't just outline reform, it forced a confrontation. Section 1. Immediate and mandatory disclosure of all exculpatory evidence in federal cases, without exception, regardless of prosecutorial strategy or political pressure. It classified the withholding of such evidence as obstruction, punishable by felony conviction and mandatory disbarment. No delay, no discretion, no hiding behind sealed motions. Section 2. Federal protection and legal immunity for whistleblowers exposing misconduct within the Department of Justice or affiliated agencies. It demanded the creation of a publicly funded, independently governed whistleblower defense fund and a secure, anonymous reporting system not monitored by the same institutions it existed to expose. Section 3. Establishment of a permanent, bipartisan Judicial Oversight Council, equally appointed by both parties, operating beyond congressional interference, with full investigative powers over judges, prosecutors, and senior DOJ officials. This body would have subpoena authority, public reporting requirements, and the mandate to review any case where misconduct had been credibly alleged. It didn't read like ambition, it read like necessity. The vote in committee was unanimous. Outside the Capitol, crowds that had once gathered in protest now gathered in support. They weren't waving party flags. They were holding up printouts of the bill itself, underlined in yellow, highlighted in red, annotated in ballpoint ink by teachers, veterans, paralegals, mothers, pastors, and teenagers who had never watched C-SPAN until Jasmine Crockett stood alone at that podium. By the end of the week, over 36 members of Congress had signed on as co-sponsors. Within 10 days, the House passed the bill by an overwhelming majority. And as it moved to the Senate floor, something changed, not just in the halls of power, but in the public. They didn't see the Transparent Justice Act as Jasmine's comeback. They saw it as their opening. The ceremony wasn't televised live. There was no countdown clock, no grand orchestra playing patriotic strings, no carefully choreographed applause line. Just a long oak desk in the Rose Garden, a blue sky heavy with the weight of what had been survived, and a bill waiting for ink. The president stood, pen poised, with the Transparent Justice Act laid open before him, its pages still slightly curled at the corners, as if even the paper knew it had traveled through fire to get here. Reporters waited behind a velvet rope. Jasmine Crockett stood to his right, silent, composed, watchful. She didn't reach for the pen. She didn't pose for photos. She stood with her hands behind her back, heels rooted in the stone like someone bearing witness, not someone claiming credit. The president glanced at her once, just briefly, then signed. One stroke, two, three. It was done. He turned and handed her the pen. She accepted it with both hands, slowly, carefully, like it wasn't a souvenir but a responsibility. Then she said only one sentence. No victory lap, no applause line, no spin. This is not a win. This is a warning. The words dropped into the still air like steel, not loud, but permanent. It wasn't just the political class that heard it. It was every judge who had ever misused discretion to crush the defenseless. Every prosecutor who had buried evidence because the truth was inconvenient. Every bureaucrat who had turned process into punishment. Jasmine's words weren't just a statement. They were a verdict. News anchors scrambled to find sound bites. But the story had already written itself. It wasn't about celebration. It was about consequence. That afternoon, photos of the signing spread online like fire. Not because of pomp or pageantry, but because of the expression on Jasmine's face. There was no joy, no triumph, just quiet resolve. People saw it, and they understood. The bill had not been born from political strategy. It had been carved from survival. Over the next few hours, the Act's clauses began to circulate. Legal forms dissected each section. Law professors rewrote their syllabi. Advocacy groups released toolkits. Whistleblower defense networks activated. And in offices across the country, attorneys pulled up old case files and asked the question no one had dared ask before. What did they hide? On Capitol Hill, the mood shifted like a storm passing. Hallways that once echoed with platitudes now carried lower voices, tighter conversations. For the first time in years, the weight of power had a shadow beside it, accountability. And the signature on the bill, though penned by the president, bore Jasmine's fingerprints in every line. She left the White House quietly that evening. No interviews, no celebrations. She declined every network invitation, every magazine spread. Instead, she took a cab to a neighborhood legal clinic on the edge of Southeast D.C., where a grandmother in a headscarf was waiting with a question about her housing voucher. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to Washington to become a symbol. She came to change what symbols were allowed to mean, and now the law had caught up with the truth. Jasmine Crockett didn't disappear, but she did something rarer. She stepped out of the spotlight by choice. In the days following the signing of the Transparent Justice Act, her inbox overflowed with invitations. Morning shows wanted her redemption arc. Cable news hosts wanted exclusive interviews. Think tanks offered keynote speaker slots. Book agents reached out with six-figure proposals for a memoir she hadn't written and wasn't ready to. She turned them all down. Instead, she rented a used sedan under an alias, packed 2 suitcases, one for clothes, one for legal pads and community case files, and drove south on I-95. No staff, no entourage, no press trailing behind. Her first stop was the South Dallas Community Center, where she used to volunteer on weekends. Before the title, before the hearings, before the trial that nearly erased her. The building had peeling paint and a broken front light, but the folding chairs were still there. The smell of floor wax and stale coffee hadn't changed. She didn't announce her return. Word traveled anyway. By nightfall, there was a line of people outside the door. No camera crews, just neighbors. A mother holding eviction papers. A laid-off custodian trying to understand his disability denial. A teenager asking if a juvenile record could be cleared. Jasmine sat at a folding table, sleeves rolled, pen in hand, listening like she had all the time in the world. She didn't talk about the bill she passed. She didn't mention the courtroom. She asked one question over and over. Tell me what they did to you. This wasn't politics. This was purpose. She didn't come to offer salvation. She came to write affidavits, to track names, to make lists of city departments that had stopped answering phones. She offered no promises, only follow-ups. She stayed until the lights flickered. She helped sweep the floor when it was over. No one called her Congresswoman there. They just called her Jasmine. And across the country, in town after town, stories like that started multiplying. In Baltimore, she sat at a table in a church basement where a dozen parents held unpaid bail bond invoices for crimes that never made it to trial. In Jackson, Mississippi, she helped a Vietnam vet fill out an appeal form that had been returned 3 times without explanation. In Bakersfield, she listened to a mother sob over her son's deportation, despite a clerical error the court wouldn't acknowledge. She took no photos, refused live streams, turned off her location, but the stories traveled anyway. Because Jasmine wasn't chasing legacy, she was honoring it, not by standing above people, but by sitting with them. And in that humility, that tireless return to the margins, she did what no law, no bill, no speech could do alone. She made justice feel human again. It started with a wall, not in Washington, not in a courtroom, but in Dallas on the side of a crumbling factory, long condemned and half forgotten by the city's development plans. One morning, passers-by noticed fresh paint, an 8-foot-tall image of Jasmine Crockett's face, rendered in raw brushstrokes, looking not triumphant but calm. Underneath, in stark white letters, someone had written, "She made the powerful tremble." No one claimed it. No one took credit. But by the next morning, there were flowers at the base, candles, notes tucked into the cracks between bricks, some anonymous, some signed with trembling hands. The mural wasn't about hero worship. It was about relief. That someone, anyone, had not just survived the system, but forced it to look back at itself. And as the days passed, more murals appeared. In Flint, Michigan, her silhouette was painted across a boarded-up school with the words, "The truth needs no microphone." In Tucson, it was stenciled beneath a courthouse window. "When the law breaks people, someone must hold it accountable." No two murals were the same, but they shared a pulse, a quiet kind of anger that had finally found direction. But not all echoes were painted on walls. Some came from living rooms, from kitchens where mothers sat with daughters and talked about courage not as theory, but as memory. In Oakland, a single mother who'd been fighting an illegal eviction sat her 12-year-old down and said, "You know that woman on TV? That's how we don't give up." In Philadelphia, a grandmother who'd marched for civil rights 50 years earlier held her granddaughter's hand and whispered, "I thought they stopped making women like that. I was wrong." At community centers, little girls stood up during story hour and asked librarians if they could dress as Jasmine for their history presentations. Boys began asking about how to file a complaint, not because they wanted to fight, but because they now believed someone might listen. Teachers revised lesson plans. Pastors rewrote Sunday sermons. And in courtrooms from Georgia to Illinois, public defenders began citing the Transparent Justice Act like a lifeline they never thought they'd see passed. But perhaps the most remarkable change came in how people began showing up, not for Jasmine, but for each other. Neighborhoods that had once folded under the weight of broken promises began to hold meetings again. Legal aid booths were set up in church parking lots. Volunteer translators began offering help outside municipal buildings. People weren't waiting for politicians to come fix things. They were fixing them themselves, with handwritten forms, folding tables, cardboard signs, and a shared belief that the system, if pressured hard enough, had to bend. Jasmine never attended the mural dedications. She never posted about them, but she saw them. On nights when she drove alone between cities, she'd pull over, step out, and stand quietly across the street from the art that bore her face. She never took selfies, never left a signature, but she'd sometimes leave something small behind. Her handwritten initials on the back of a sticker, a pressed flower on the ledge, a folded note that said, "Keep going, you're not alone." Because Jasmine Crockett didn't set out to be the subject of murals. She set out to make sure everyone else never had to fight alone again. And somewhere between the paint and the protest, the stories and the silence, the country finally started listening, not to her name, but to what it meant. In a world addicted to noise, Jasmine Crockett had found a different kind of power. The kind that moved not through headlines, but through hallways, back rooms, and broken systems that could no longer ignore the soft resistance taking root inside them. Justice, she realized, didn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it walked in quietly, carrying a clipboard, asking calm questions no one expected. And when it did, it was far more dangerous than outrage. Because outrage fades, but discipline whispers until something cracks. Her inbox was filled now with reports, not from lobbyists or donors, but from bus drivers, cafeteria workers, nurses, court clerks, and overworked interns in district offices across the country. They wrote of files they'd found, patterns they noticed, harassment swept under office rugs, unprocessed housing applications lost twice. They didn't ask Jasmine to fix it. They just asked, "Where do I send this?" And Jasmine always answered. She built a system, quietly, efficiently. A rotating legal team reviewed submissions. A network of pro bono lawyers began triaging credible cases. Local journalists received encrypted summaries. Whistleblowers were offered anonymous channels and free legal aid through the new oversight fund birthed by her bill. None of it made the news. That was the point. It wasn't spectacle. It was structure. Reform not drafted in marble halls, but mapped in community centers, union meetings, and the kind of neighborhood kitchens where chairs don't match and the coffee's always 2 hours old. The DOJ, under pressure, launched its own internal audit unit. Judges started recusing themselves from cases where financial conflicts were now traceable under new disclosure rules. A quiet reshuffling swept through mid-tier agencies. Officials who had once thrived on opacity were suddenly retiring early. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't call it victory. She called it momentum, and she knew it was fragile. In Albuquerque, a city clerk reinstated 300 expunged juvenile records after a single phone call from Jasmine's team. In Georgia, a small-town judge stepped down after public defenders filed a complaint citing 3 years of biased bail rulings, all documented and submitted by a former intern who used to be ignored at staff meetings. In Flagstaff, a courthouse hired 2 full-time interpreters for the first time after a disabled immigrant father testified on video through an advocacy channel Jasmine helped fund that he'd signed away his parental rights without understanding the paperwork. No one held rallies. There were no parades. But something had shifted. Justice was no longer something people waited for. It was something they acted on, quietly, deliberately, without permission. And Jasmine? She kept moving, city to city, state to state, collecting affidavits like seeds, planting systems where no one had ever thought to water them. And wherever she went, she left behind no banners, no chants, only the echo of one truth repeated in soft voices, over battered desks, across crowded waiting rooms. We don't have to scream anymore. We just have to show up. And that whisper, multiplied by thousands, was shaking the foundations more than any roar ever could. Long after the cameras turned away and the headlines found newer crises to chase, the aftershocks of Jasmine Crockett's stand kept moving, through city councils, courtroom transcripts, classroom debates, and whispered conversations in grocery store parking lots. They started as ripples. One law, one trial, one woman who refused to kneel before the machinery built to erase her. But ripples, when multiplied, don't stay small. They become waves. And in places where change once seemed like fantasy, people began moving. In Cleveland, a group of law students who had followed Jasmine's hearing livestream in stunned silence launched a nonprofit called the Receipt Project, aimed at auditing overlooked municipal courts. In their first year, they flagged over 900 sealed cases with unexplained plea bargains and misfiled evidence. In Portland, a group of single mothers began attending eviction hearings, not for their own cases, but to sit behind strangers and take notes, offering presence, comfort, and a phone number to call if something went wrong. They called themselves the Back Row, and judges started asking why more and more tenants suddenly came in knowing their rights. In Mississippi, a social studies teacher rewrote her entire curriculum after watching Jasmine's final address. Instead of just covering the 3 branches of government, she added a 4th unit, the cost of silence. Her 8th graders didn't just memorize constitutional amendments. They staged mock oversight hearings, drafted reform proposals, and wrote essays not about founding fathers, but about people like Jasmine Crockett, who walked into history not to be remembered, but to remember others. Meanwhile, in boardrooms and barbershops, in classrooms and corner stores, people were saying the same thing. If they could come after her with cameras rolling and laws behind them, what have they done to the people no one ever filmed? That question didn't disappear. It lingered. It festered. It changed how people read news stories. It changed how juries deliberated. It changed how court clerks filed documents, because once people saw the truth once, they couldn't unsee it. And Jasmine didn't need to be present for any of it. She didn't need to retweet, endorse, or reply. The story had moved beyond her. It had attached itself to others, to teachers, to factory workers, to cashiers, to retired veterans who had never heard the term exculpatory evidence before, but now asked their grandkids about it over Sunday dinner. That was the power of what she left behind. Not a flame that demanded attention, but an ember tucked into 1,000 pockets, waiting to be passed on. In one high school auditorium in Des Moines, a student council president stood up during a citywide youth forum and said, "I used to think justice was for lawyers, but I watched that trial. I saw that woman stand still while the system cracked around her. And I realized justice isn't law. It's what happens when people refuse to lie down." The room went quiet. Then someone clapped. Then everyone did. Because the room wasn't just applauding Jasmine Crockett. They were applauding the truth she proved. That dignity, when defended without apology, ripples out in ways even the powerful can't stop. And when enough ripples move in the same direction, eventually they become a wave. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The bill became law. The law became precedent. And precedent slowly began reshaping policy. Yet through all the movement, all the reforms and reassignments, all the news cycles that came and went, one thing remained constant. The question, not written in legislation or spoken aloud in interviews, not taught in textbooks or printed in headlines, but carried in the back of people's minds like a whisper that refused to fade. What kind of country tries to silence a woman like Jasmine Crockett? And who let it happen in the first place? It wasn't just about guilt. It was about complicity, about the quiet, bureaucratic nods, the inboxes left unanswered, the voters who had scrolled past headlines, the lawyers who had stayed quiet in staff meetings, the journalists who had questioned her tone more than they questioned the missing documents, the judges who had said nothing, done nothing, even when they saw something. The systems, yes, but also the people who ran them, obeyed them, benefited from them, then claimed surprise when it all cracked in the open. Because Jasmine's story didn't expose a single villain. It exposed a culture where survival is mistaken for success, where anger is policed more than corruption, where truth is filtered through public relations firms, and where the most dangerous people are the ones who ask why. And Jasmine never stopped asking why, even when it cost her peace, reputation, safety, even when she was the only one in the room asking it. That's what made the silence after her hearing so loud. It wasn't just what the system did to her, it was what we let it do, what we excused, what we normalized, what we shrugged off as just politics or how power works. Jasmine never declared herself a hero. She rejected that label every time. But the question she left behind, quiet, cutting, permanent, was one no institution could bury. If this could happen to her, who's watching out for the people with no cameras, no lawyers, no platform? That question began surfacing in strange places, in late-night union meetings, in book clubs and barbershops, in grocery store aisles and DMV lines. People began asking, what about the ones who didn't go viral? What about the names no one remembers? And in asking, they began changing. Because the story of Jasmine Crockett wasn't just about a courtroom or a reform bill. It was a mirror. It showed us what we tolerate, what we ignore, and what we allow to happen in our names. Now, as the final page turns and the credits of history begin to roll, that mirror remains. Not to reflect Jasmine. She already knows who she is. It's for us to ask ourselves, when the next person is thrown into the fire, will we be watching? Will we be silent? Or will we finally speak before it's too late? The story ends not with a statement, but with a challenge. Because justice isn't just what we cheer for. It's what we protect, especially when no one's watching. In a community center off a back road near Tulsa, where the linoleum floor still bears the scuffs of 1,000 folding chairs, Jasmine Crockett arrived just before sunset. The meeting had already started, veterans trading stories about housing delays, mothers organizing childcare shifts, a former nurse sketching out a plan for a mobile clinic. No one noticed her at first. She didn't want them to. She took the last chair in the back row, quietly, coat still on, not as a guest of honor, but as another pair of hands ready to listen. The room smelled like burnt coffee and pencil shavings. The heaters buzzed like tired bees. And on a bulletin board at the front, someone had pinned a photo, grainy, printed on office paper, of Jasmine speaking on the courthouse steps months ago. Underneath, in block letters, someone had written, "She didn't save the system. She made it bleed." Jasmine didn't look at it long. She wasn't here to be remembered. She was here to remember the faces, the pain, the stubborn faith that people still had in something better. As the meeting ended and people rose to fold their chairs, a young woman approached her, nervous, probably 22, maybe younger. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't say, "Thank you." She just asked, voice low, "How do you know when it's your turn to speak up?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She glanced around the room, the laughter, the notes, the flyers on the table. Then she gestured toward the last empty chair, still unfolded, still warm. "When you realize no one's sitting there for you," she said softly, "that's when it's your turn." The girl looked at the chair, then nodded. Moments later, Jasmine stepped outside into the cold. She had places to be, files to review, stories to carry. The road stretched ahead, unlit but familiar, and she walked toward it not with certainty, but with clarity, because her job had never been to finish the story, only to make sure the pages stayed open long enough for others to write their lines. That night, after everyone left, the custodian walked through the room, turning off lights. He paused at the empty chair, didn't fold it, didn't move it, just left it exactly as it was, facing forward, quiet, expectant. And over time, people began to notice that chair. In meetings, in classrooms, in court hearings, a seat always left open, not for Jasmine, but for the next woman who refuses to stay quiet, the next worker who refuses to be dismissed, the next neighbor who dares to say, "I'll stand." The chair becomes a symbol, not of a person, but of an invitation, a space waiting to be filled by courage, not credentials, by truth, not titles. And so it stays, unclaimed but never forgotten, not a monument, but a mirror, waiting. True justice isn't a courtroom victory. It's what happens when ordinary people refuse to stay silent in the face of power. Jasmine Crockett's story reminds us that even when the system feels too big to fight, courage, consistency, and quiet truth can shake its foundations. Change doesn't always roar. It often begins with one person daring to speak when silence is expected. Your turn. What is one injustice, big or small, that you've witnessed and stayed silent about? What would it look like to speak up now? Let today be the moment you choose action over comfort.